Hi everyone, and welcome to my project on the Allied aircraft of the Second World War. I chose this area because I think that World War II was when aviation in the wartime setting saw its fullest potential, and we saw a whole bunch of different types of aircraft that really reflected this. So I'm focusing on the Allied aircraft, which has three main factions. There were other factions, but three main factions: the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. All right, so I'm going to start off the United States, and the first aircraft I chose was the F-6F-5 Hellcat. So initially, I wanted to put in the F-4U Corsair because it's probably the most famous naval airplane during the war, and it's definitely the best. But I chose the Hellcat because it came at a time when the U.S. Navy really needed it. So prior to the Hellcat, the Wildcat was the main fighter for the Navy, and it was a good fighter, but it couldn't really perform well when compared to the Japanese Zero, which was its main combat adversary. So when the Hellcat came along, this really helped the Navy, and it gave them a good advantage in uh, getting an air superiority. So the the Hellcat had better armor, it was faster, and it had more fuel than the Wildcat. So the difference was pretty stark, and the victories were immediate. 75% of all U.S. aerial Pacific victories involved the Hellcat. So it was a very successful fighter. Next up is the P-47 Thunderbolt. So the Thunderbolt was introduced in 1943, and it was initially designed as a fighter escort, although soon its potential as a close ground support aircraft was soon realized, and it performed in both of these functions very well. Um, so well, in fact, that by the time World War II had ended, 16,000 of these aircraft had been deployed, not just in Europe, where it's probably most famous, but um, but in all theaters of the war. So the next aircraft I chose was the P-51D Mustang. Now the initial P-51s didn't perform extremely successfully, and that all changed when they put the Merlin engine in it. And after that, it became the airplane that we all know today. It's perhaps the most famous fighter of World War II. Now, it was introduced in 1944, and it was designed as a fighter escort for bombing campaigns, and this really helped that function during the war. It, unlike many other aircraft, it could fly all the way to the bombing location and all the way back, providing support during that period. In fact, during Big Week, which is a famous bombing campaign, it shot down 17% of experienced German Luftwaffe pilots. All right, next up is the B-17 Flying Fortress. This is the most famous World War II bomber. So the B-17, it was called the Flying Fortress because it was designed, like the name implies, to be a fortress. There were guns mounted in different positions, supposed to provide complete 360-degree cover. And sounds good on paper, but didn't really work practically. Many of them were shot down, and it was extremely dangerous to be a sorry, to be a crew member on a B-17. In fact, we really didn't start to see casualties to drop until after they started getting fire escorts like the P-51. So up next we have Great Britain and the various aircraft that Great Britain produced. So first up is the Hawker Hurricane. So the Hurricane, at least the first model, was introduced in 1937. Interestingly enough, it was the first RAF monoplane fighter, which I think that's pretty cool. Um, it was widely easy to fly, and it's most famous for its role during the Battle of Britain, which the Hurricane and the Spitfire very successfully defended Britain from German bombs. Now, the Hurricane struggled against German fighters like the Bf-109, but what it could do was it could take down bombers very well. So it was used in that setting, and it was used very, very successfully. But for the fighters, the RAF had the Spitfire. So the Spitfire was introduced in 1938, and the Spitfire could go toe-to-toe with the different German aircraft. The Spitfire is most famous for what it did during the Battle of Britain, which, like I said, defended Britain against German bombs. But it was also used pretty successfully as a reconnaissance aircraft. So we think of it as this great fighter plane, and it was, but it was pretty versatile. There were many things that they put it to use for, and it saw a lot of success in. All right, up next is the Avro 683 Lancaster. This was perhaps the most successful RAF bomber. Now, initially, it was not very successful. The initial design had twin engines instead of four, and it did not see a lot of success. So the aircraft was redesigned to be four engined, and it was extremely successful. And it actually wasn't a British aircraft. It was designed and built in Canada, which I think is pretty interesting. And like I said, it was a successful bomber, but it was very successful with night bombings. So they used it a lot for night raids. Okay, so up next we have the Soviet Union and the different aircraft I chose for the Soviet Union. So the first one is the Yak-3. Now, the Yak-3 came in later during the war. It was introduced in 1944, and it was probably the greatest aircraft that the Soviet Union had during the war. It could outperform many of the different German aircraft, like the Bf-109, for instance, and and it really helped the Soviets get an advantage, or more of an advantage, over the Axis powers. Now, when I say it was introduced in 1944, that's technically true, but really all it was just an updated version from the Yak-1. Now, the Yak-1 it was a pretty good aircraft. One of the biggest changes they made was they changed it from a wooden and metal airframe to an all metal airframe, which in turn made it harder for the Germans to shoot at. So the next aircraft I have is the I-2 and the 3 Shutmavik. So the Shutmavik was introduced in 1941, and its initial conception was a flying tank. That's what the designers had in mind when they built it. Um, as many as 36,000 of them were produced. It was used throughout the Eastern Front, especially so in Stalingrad, which is perhaps the most famous and important battle fought on the Eastern Front. Now, during its design phase, there was a bit of controversy over the tail gunner as it was removed and then eventually put back in. But the plane itself was extremely successful, and it's generally considered to be one of the best ground attacking aircraft in the entire war. All right, now next up is the MiG-3. Now, the MiG-3 was not a very good airplane, but I wanted to put it in because I think it still played an important role for the Soviet Union. It was one of the only fighter aircraft that the Soviets had in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa, which was, of course, when the Nazis began their attack on the Soviet Union. And this aircraft was introduced in 1941, and like I said, it wasn't very good. It was a liability at lower altitudes, so it could not perform well when compared to the German aircraft, and it was a fairly easy target. Now, when you got to higher altitudes, it was actually a little bit of a different story, but still, as most combat took place at lower altitudes, it was just more of a liability than anything. And in fact, as better aircraft came out, like the Yak-3, for instance, it became less and less of an importance. And eventually, it was just used for reconnaissance entirely, so it was not kept as a fighter at all. Okay, so next up, I have a little bonus area I wanted to talk about. This is covering a couple of Axis aircraft, and while not allies, this whole area interested me because it was a time where just the innovation of aviation and its strategic implementation was extremely important to the war, and I would be remiss if I did not cover this area of the war. So I wanted to discuss briefly about the Me-262 and Valkyrie missile program. So the Valkyrie missile program, I'll refer to it as the V2, which was a rocket. It was introduced in October 1942. Now, you didn't really see it until 1944. Its first launch was against Paris, and subsequently, 1,000 of them were launched at Great Britain, which did a great deal of damage. A lot of them were captured by the Soviets subsequently after the war ended, and they actually used it for their space program. They were very interested in the German rocket technology. Now, so was the United States. In fact, the United States took the guy in charge of the Valkyrie missile program, named Wernher von Braun, and they brought him to the United States and put him in charge of America's space program. Now, the Me-262 is extremely interesting because it was the first operational fighter jet. The Me-262, it was introduced in 1944, although its first test flight was actually in 1941. Due to some engine problems, as you might expect with it being an early jet engine, it wasn't put into a combat setting until later. Now, these problems were set on the back burner due to the Luftwaffe believing that the piston-powered aircraft could finish the job. Obviously, they couldn't. 1944 comes around, and the Axis powers are losing. So 1944 rolls around, and the German engineers are able to fix the various problems they had with the Me-262 engine. Most of them, at least. And this led it to become the best fighter of the war. You know, you typically think of the P-51 or Spitfire or the Yak-3, but the Me-262, simply because it was a jet engine fighter, it was faster than all the other aircraft, it was more versatile, and it played a big role at the end of the war. By the time it was officially deployed, it was pretty much too late for it to do too much damage for the Allies. Its main role was to shoot down bombers, and it fulfilled its role very successfully. And it could outperform, like I said, many of the Allied fighters. During one period, in fact, over 500 aircraft were destroyed by the Me-262, while the Germans only lost 100 of them. So I just wanted to mention these because I felt that they were very interesting and very important to the war and aviation in general. So thank you for watching this video, and that's it.